All right, we are good. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Legit Leadership Live, episode number 6. We are here today with our esteemed guest, Dr. Bahira Sherif Trask. I'm Raabia Shafi. And Bahira, I'm so delighted that you are here with us today. So thank you for making the time out of your schedule.
Thank you so much, Raabia, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. So, and just as a kind of a reminder here, we have started our Legit Leadership Live series for all of you who are joining from the US, from around the world in different time zones. So thank you for making space in your day today. And the real purpose is let's have some real-time conversations with leaders across different industries. And I'm so excited to dive in with Bahira today for our episode. Bahira, I would love to dive in and ask you a bunch of questions, but I want to make sure also you have a chance to share a little bit of who you are. Can you give us your current role right now, what you're up to, and then I can kind of fill in the gaps a little bit with some more of your bio?
Sounds great. And please feel free to ask me about whatever it is you find interesting.
I love it.
Yeah. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I have been a professor at the University of Delaware for the last 24 years in a department called Human Development and Family Sciences. And I'm just finishing my 6th year as the chair of the department.
Wonderful. I love that. And I wanted to share with the group here, I have a very special place in my heart for the University of Delaware, as we have a mutual contact, and that's how we connected. My aunt and uncle both are professors there, Monica Shafi and Kaiser Shafi. So it's great that we've been able to make this connection, for sure. So
they are wonderful people, and Monica has really been a very dear friend and good and wise advisor also.
To me as well, I will tell you, throughout my life. So that's wonderful. Bahira also, I wanted to share with all of you that her research focuses on the relationship between family change, growing family complexity, and globalization in Western and non-Western contexts. And specifically, she focused on the factors influencing families and programs and policies that can really assist and strengthen families. And over the last several years, Bahira has been invited to share her research with a variety of constituent groups all over the world, including several expert group meetings at the United Nations. And Bahira, I wanted to ask you, because I'm here in New York City and we have the UN quite literally on the other side. I'm on the west side, but it hits the East River. Were you at the UN in New York, or where were you invited to do these meetings?
Yeah, most of the meetings have been at UN headquarters in New York. So, and I'm always very honored when they invite me, and I love going because it's just so, you have people from all over the world, and it's always a wonderful, interesting experience. But the UN is a big, complex organization with a lot of different, they have sort of the internal UN, and then they have what's called civil society also, which are organizations that are affiliated with the UN in different ways. And so through my participation in the central part of the UN, I've also been invited to different parts of the world to speak. So yesterday morning at 4 a.m, I spoke in Krakow, Poland. But I was here. So.
You were virtually there in Krakow, which is a beautiful place.
Again, affiliated through the UN. So
got it. Oh, I love that. And I'm just thinking about the global work you do, right? Because with families, and we'll get into that in a moment, but I'm curious to dive into globalization and family change, especially in light of the pandemic. So that's going to be one of my first things. Once I'll just wrap up your bio in a moment, and we'll dive into that. Bahira holds a BA in political science and international relations from Yale University and a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. And Bahira has authored and edited 5 books, including, I believe this is your latest, right? Women, Work, and Globalization, Challenges and Opportunities. Yes. So yes, and I know you regularly participate in expert group meetings, like we said, at the UN. And this piece is really interesting to me, which I would love to get into as well, speaking on issues of gender equality and empowerment and work-life reconciliation. So maybe we can start with that. Bahira, I would love to know, when you think about the role of women, the role of families, you've been at this studying this as a researcher and an expert for years. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the dynamics and things that you've seen shift in light of the global pandemic that we're still navigating?
Thank you very much for this question. So, as a preface, in the past, when I used people sort of like at cocktail parties make conversation and they ask, what do you do? I say, I'm a professor. Their eyes start to glaze over. They're like, well, what do you study? And I say, well, family change, gender issues. Their eyes glaze over even more. And, the comment I would get is gender issues, we're long past that. And I have heard the same thing from my students. And then came the global pandemic. And all of a sudden, gender issues are front and center, because what has happened, not just in the United States, but globally, is that with everybody staying at home, working from home, all of a sudden, all of the sort of traditional gender roles that a lot of people thought, especially in the West, are gone, they have re-emerged. So, in the United States, I think in September, over 866,000 women dropped out of the paid labor force. And this has been happening around the world because of responsibilities having to do primarily with around taking care of children, taking care of ill family members, all the sort of caretaking responsibilities that we often don't recognize.
For sure. So it's like the light has been shining now, where I think also we're seeing cracks in the system, if you will, when it comes to programs and policies. And I know that's an area also that you've specialized in, you've researched. Can you share whether it's pandemic related or even in the recent past, let's say pre-COVID, if we can even remember the world before it all happened? What are some of the programs and policies that either you've been an advocate for or that you've found that are helpful in supporting the growth and development for families at large?
Thank you. This is a big, complicated question. So I will just focus on a couple of things. I think work-family conflict has become sort of one of the number one, if not the number one issue that people are facing globally, and also, across all social classes. So everybody in different forms is trying to reconcile their work and their family responsibilities. And it differs, of course, what part of the world you are and how many resources you have. So for people who have very few resources, their jobs have become even more precarious. They're very, very vulnerable to any kind of economic swing. And we've seen in the pandemic, so many people have lost their jobs, or they're working in dangerous jobs. So, when my friends start complaining about being at home too much, I'm not that sympathetic, because we're the lucky ones who've been able to stay safe. So, but for people at the other end of the spectrum, people who make a lot of money, they have more resources to deal with their family and domestic chores. But they are expected to be on 24/7. And, they face a lot of work-related pressures and suffer from burnout and depression because they're not able to distance themselves from their work. So there've been a lot of different repercussions. And something I've been thinking about a lot is, because I keep hearing about it from colleagues and friends, is so many people have had mental health issues during the pandemic. So, and that's a topic I don't think we talk about enough. And it's really been exacerbated with people being lonely, kids not being able to interact with their friends, all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. And that it leads me to something else that I wanted to get your take on. I mean, as you know, and you and I have connected before this, the nature of the work that I do is working with leaders. It's working across industries, across demographics. So we span all genders, including women, and those of my community here and kind of friends of the firm who are tuning in today to learn more about your perspective. Can you share with us, what do you think are the most important things that we should know about women and leadership and work, regardless of our own demographic background?
This is a great question, and it's one I've actually thought a lot about. I think as a woman, and now I'm going to generalize, but still, and there are different situations and different circumstances, so I understand all that. But I think the number one thing I've had to deal with this psychologically is, as a woman, you're going to be perceived differently than as a man when you are in a leadership position, despite all the changes in our society. And I've seen it so many times around me. So, and when I say you're going to be perceived differently, I mean you're going to be perceived under, you're going to be held to a higher standard. So people are going to look at you more critically, and they're going to watch your performance more carefully. And this is not, it's not because anybody has evil intent. I really think it's an outgrowth still of pretty stereotypical traditional gender roles. And so when you see a woman in a leadership position and she's a strong woman with a vision and is willing to speak up, it defies some sort of unspoken norm that still exists underneath everything. And that's why I was saying even the pandemic, to me, you know, from a sort of anthropological perspective, has been really interesting, because I've been arguing this for the last 30 years, that we have very traditional concepts that are embedded in our institutions, in our value systems, but they only come out to the forefront under certain circumstances. And the pandemic has really exposed that. But when you look at workplaces, like I said, I see it all the time, that women are judged in a different way. People have no problem talking about what women look like, how they're dressed, how they present themselves. And then even the issue of, for example, ambition is very interesting. If a man is very ambitious, he's seen as a go-getter and he's going to make a difference. If a woman is ambitious, people are very suspicious about why she's ambitious. Or, for example, in terms of, I'm trying to think of a better word than aggressiveness, but if a woman is direct and really states what she wants to do, that's not always perceived in a positive light. Again, in a man, it's interpreted in a different way. So I just find this interesting, that with all the changes in our world, and there are, because women today have so many educational and occupational opportunities, even compared to when I was little. I was thinking about how much the world has changed just, you know, in the time I've been alive. And still we hold, or many people still hold, some of those values.
For sure. Yeah. And I think difference is the key word. It's almost like, for better or worse, like navigating it is up to every person's journey. Like, but you mentioned something so important. As you've been thinking about this for a while, you've been seeing these things since you were younger, and then your parents' generation, right? So it's kind of, there have been some shifts, I know, with my generation and the future. Like, I'm thinking about my cousin's kids, my sister's kid. Like, I'm like, what is life going to be like for my baby niece, for example, who's not even a year old yet? And I would love to know, if you can kind of use your crystal ball to look into the future, what do you think it's going to take to really continue to not just chip away at these gender differences and stereotypes, but what's it going to take to overhaul things so we can get to closer, if not to the place of equality and equity?
I actually think it's happening. I think when I look at my daughter, I have a 14-year-old daughter, and I look at how she thinks about things and how she's being socialized. I look at my students that are in their 20s, and there's a different mindset. You know, the boys are growing up with mothers that are in the workplace, many of them were successful mothers. And so there's a real shift that is happening, specifically in Western countries. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I think as you have more and more women in positions of power, they become role models. And look, we have our first vice president now as a woman, and a woman of color at that. And that changes even, it sort of chips away at images people have in their minds. So I'm very optimistic that for our children and grandchildren, they're going to experience a different world. When I look even at the women who, were my mentors in graduate school, they had a very difficult time. Academia was very, very male dominated, and it was almost impossible in cases to become a leader in the academic world for a woman. And that's really changed. So
yeah. And I would love to hear a little bit more about because I know I've done my BA, my MA. I've always, also because of my aunt and uncle, and my family is so passionate about education. So I have a respect for academia quite a bit. I would love to hear, in your experience, and just like whether it's life at UDel or the previous universities you've worked with, like what have you seen as it relates to shifts and changes in pursuing an academic career, or kind of working within that ecosystem?
I think it depends on the field, because I'm in the social sciences, and now the social sciences are dominated by women. That wasn't the case when I started, but it definitely, we're talking about a span of over 30 years. So there's been a real shift. I don't know that this is really true in the hard sciences. I am involved with a group called Advance at the University of Delaware, and they're promoting women in STEM fields. And the numbers are still very low. And when you also look at the numbers of women who are full professors and who are leaders of departments and deans and presidents, that's also still very low. But because there are a lot of women in the pipeline, and there are also a lot of mentorship programs in place, and mentorship has become an important part of career development, I actually think that things have really changed and are changing as well. So I knew when I became first department chair my first year, and they have like meetings just for the chairs, and most of the chairs were men, older men. And now when I go, there are a lot of women who are, sort of in their mid to late 40s. So there's a real shift that has happened, even in this short time that I've been, in the position that I'm currently in.
Yeah, I think there's something very powerful about continuing a professional journey with an institution and being a firsthand witness to, when I first walked into the rooms, X number of years ago, it was like this, and actually seeing the nature of, just the dynamics shift and change, where there's like, oh, different people are here, so that sounds like a very powerful experience for you as well in your career.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening, but this, like I said, despite all these changes, I would argue that there are these insidious still gender-based evaluations that people don't like to always acknowledge. So, and there's a lot of research about that, about how different genders are perceived in the workplace, even in meetings, who speaks, who gets listened to, whose suggestions get followed, and all of that.
For sure. Yeah. I know much of my coaching focuses on that as well, too. Like I work with all demographics and backgrounds. And one of the key areas in a program that I'm really targeting is to support women of color leaders, really kind of for exactly what you're saying. Let's take a look at those narratives and then ultimately decide what do we stick with us in our own minds? We can't necessarily change the whole system, but we can continue to work with it. But what are we carrying with us that's serving us? And then what's just kind of holding us back? So I think that's a piece of the, like you said, the insidious pieces, like there's a two-way street there as well.
Yes.
So Bahira, one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about, which I know we mentioned the United Nations, when we were first chatting, I shared how much your work in political science and cultural anthropology and with the UN, there's such a deep passion and interest of my own, especially having grown up in the Washington, D.C. area, which, as you know, is a true hub for international relations. You also have a multicultural background with parents from Germany and Egypt. I would love to hear if you can share with us what are some of the key lessons and insights that you've picked up along the way as it relates to human behavior and families in terms of what unites us across cultures, and then what are some of maybe the more dividing or different pieces that you've found?
I love that you bring my background into this, because obviously I've thought a lot about it and my own path. Now, you have to remember that when my parents met, my mother is German and my father was Egyptian. He's unfortunately dead now. When they met in the late 1950s in Germany, this was not a common, this is not America 2021 with
Right.
multiculturalism at the forefront of everybody's discourse. This
Yeah.
was, Germany very homogeneous after World War II. And my mother was as blonde and blue-eyed as you can be. And my father was quite dark and very handsome, but he was seen as an Egyptian. And so this was a very controversial match, but it was very much a love match. And they met, they fell in love, and 3 months later they were married. So
Wow.
yeah, so it was that kind of a story. And they also, by the way, they were 15 years apart. So, but being the product of that kind of a family really, it's made me very, and I think I speak for my brother also, it teaches you that all these categories that people put each other in, they don't actually matter. We all share this common humanity. And that's something that when I teach, I really try to get across to my students too. I've now traveled all over the world, and I always tell them, people want the same things. People want to have happy lives. They want love in a relationship, especially these days, by the way, younger people, they really emphasize love. But people want the best for their children. We're not that different from each other. The outsides may look or sound different, but our internal desires are the same. So I think we sometimes forget that, we so focus on difference without realizing sort of the shared desires that we have and the shared way we're made up. So
for sure. And I'd love for us to kind of take us to your classroom. Imagine us as students sitting and being a part of one of your courses at UDEL or wherever you're teaching that day. What are some lessons or kind of hoped for takeaways? What would you like us to walk away from your class thinking and understanding, or being like a little more maybe aware of in terms of what your focus is?
So I teach at the university one of the largest classes. It has over 300 people in it, called Diversity and Families. And I tell them from the get-go, I present a lot of facts and, the history of families in the United States and, racial, cultural, religious differences, then we go through relationships, marriage, parenting, all of that stuff. I tell them, what? I don't care if you remember all the statistics I present you and all that. I have two goals in teaching any of my classes, really. The first is I want you, when you leave my class, to look at the world a little bit differently. Yeah, I want you to examine your own assumptions and your own privilege and your own experiences and how they have formed you and the opportunities you have. We each have our own story. And I never believe in comparing yourself to anybody else, because everybody has their own set of circumstances, their own set of challenges, and their own set of opportunities. And so for each of us, life is a little bit different. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when someone tells you something, question it. I don't care who the person is. I don't care if they're the, greatest authority or expert there is. Question who this person is and why they're trying to convince you of whatever it is they're trying to convince you of. So I try to give them I try to give them a set of skills so that they consume knowledge in a new and different way. And I try to make my class very practical, so that when they enter any kind of a relationship or examine the relationships they have, they understand the circumstances, under which we are functioning. So we have a lot of interesting discussions.
Oh my gosh, I really wanted to take your class. It sounds so interesting.
Yeah.
So I thank you for sharing your 2 key goals. And I am such a big fan of not hanging out in theory, because we can talk about theoretical concepts of leadership and family, and this notion of practicality, and really like giving people a set of skills and tools that they can kind of add to their toolbox and continue to use those when they move forward in life. Would you be open to sharing with us maybe 1 or 2 of these key kind of practical thinking things, or things for us to consider, whether it's if we're entering a relationship or kind of, working with people even in the workplace?
Sure. I have a lot, actually.
Let's
take the workplace, because I think your listeners are interested in sort of, my understanding is that the people listening in are interested in developing their leadership skills.
Yes.
And so I should, for the record, say that I never sought out one of these positions. I just wanted to be a professor and sort of hide away in my office and write some articles and go teach my classes. So, but I've ended up in a variety of leadership positions because others have thought that I'd be good at it, and then they would push me in that direction. So one of the key lessons is listen to feedback from others, because we see ourselves a certain way and others may see things in you that you don't see. And we started the conversation talking about gender issues and women. And I think women in particular have this, I consider it a problem. I went to an interesting talk a couple of years ago in DC at the Women's Policy Institute. And there was a political leader, a woman speaking. And she was saying that a big difference between women and men is a lot of men want to go into politics. They like running. She said it is very difficult to persuade most women to enter politics. Women always think, well, I don't have this qualification. I'm not good at this. And there are studies about that when men and women read job ads, the woman will say, oh, I don't have I haven't done this, this, and this. I shouldn't even apply for this job.
Yeah.
If a man sees even just 30% of his qualifications in the job, he will apply for that job. So I think we perceive ourselves very differently. So I think the first is, kind of listen to some feedback. I think you need to really figure out what you want in life. I believe I have a personal philosophy that we live one time and you have to make your life look the way you want it to look. And we spend a lot of time at work. That's the way our society is structured. So you need to think about what you would enjoy. You don't know that until you try different things. So my second point would be to push yourself out of your comfort zone. This is easily said and very, very difficult to do. I try to force myself at times and I see how hard it is. I'm like, why should I do this? I don't want to do this. But it is through pushing yourself out of your comfort zone that you discover new talents you may have, new passions you may have, you make new relationships, takes you in different directions. If you stay doing the same thing over and over again, nothing's going to change. And I see that as a big problem. I see it all the time. People end up in jobs and they just do the same thing because it's comfortable and they feel they're good at it. And so they don't grow in that way. And I think as a leader, what's very important is to help others develop themselves. So once you are in a position where you can make some kind of a difference, then pushing others in that way. So
I love that. And I know one of the biggest kind of, I reference this quote all the time, and it's Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, who said, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that really when it comes to leaders, like you're saying, you're in this position of power and influence. Why not use it for good and help people to grow and expand their comfort levels and kind of reach their potential or even exceed what we think their potential is? So that's a big piece of it. Yeah. I want to just go back to something you said, even at times with you, you're thinking about your comfort zone and kind of like having to push yourself to expand your horizons. I sometimes there's this misconception, there's this term called like lionizing leaders. And I know I have guests on here who are awesome and have their strengths in very different fields. And we think like, oh, well, their comfort zone is, they're fine. They're doing just great. But could you share with us a little bit, what might be some areas in your life or in your work or whatever it is where you've had to really push yourself to expand your horizons and kind of look into a new opportunity, even if it maybe felt a little bit uncomfortable for you?
That's interesting. You would not probably believe this, but I'm actually a very shy person.
Oh.
And so having to constantly be up in front of people and, at times, especially in the position I'm in currently, I have to argue sometimes, a lot of times, an academic department, we have a large department, is not easy to run. You have a lot of different voices and a lot of conflicting interests. And you're the one who has to set the vision and get people to come on board. And that means being on a lot and taking on conflict. And I'm very conflict avoidant. And so it's at times very, very draining for me to, kind of that sort of back and forth and in front of a lot of people and sort of staying the course and staying firm and making sure everybody understands, there's nothing in it for me, but there's a lot in it for the unit. If we can get the unit to move forward. This is not easy to do. And I find it really exhausting at times. So, and like I said, just being up in front of people a lot.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think I've heard this a similar kind of scenario with people who are musical artists or like Broadway stars, and they're very shy in some instances. And in a way, it's kind of like, well, if I'm able to do this, you can kind of work through some of those that shyness, but also recognizing that this can be draining. Maybe it's not your natural disposition, but look how much we can grow if we are able to kind of shift gears a little bit and try it out. So, yes. So, Bahira, I as we kind of close up, I have a couple of more questions for you. One is, what is your take on work-family balance especially for women leaders? I mean, is it achievable? Can we really have it all? I have heard, as I'm sure you have throughout your career and the work that you do, I myself, I am single, and I've heard some critiques where they're like, well, you're just too focused on your work. And I'm like, I don't know if I buy that. Like, what does that even mean? And I have friends and family who are trying to balance out life with their kids, but then not being able to focus on careers. What's your take on work-family balance and work-life balance? Like, is it a myth that we can have it all?
Great question. So first, for the record, I don't believe in the term work-family balance. I really dislike that term. I would say work-family reconciliation. So in the United States, first of all, throughout human history, people have always worked. We used to work on farms. We were hunters and gatherers. We worked on farms. Now we work outside of the home, except the pandemic has changed that. But basically, we've just gone back 300 years in that way. So that's kind of my starting point. I've given this topic a lot of thought. I think if you have a job, a profession, or a career that you love, that's actually a wonderful thing. That's actually a gift. That is very, very different than having a job that you despise. I have seen people who have had jobs that are just drudgery. They have to go in every day. They have to sit there, listening to somebody give them orders and critique them. That is very different from the kind of job I have, where I love what I do. I find it really, really interesting. And I love that I'm able in my own little way to make a difference, in people's lives and in the world. And my wish is to make a bigger difference. I also have twins, and I had my twins later in life. And I've always felt that that was a huge gift because I had my education behind me. I was in my job, and then I was blessed by the universe with these two wonderful little human beings. Then came the question, how much time with them, how much time with my job? And what I've really learned is it's a negotiation. It's not like every day is going to be 50-50. There are times when I just have to work super hard. I just have to plow through whatever it is. And I spend less time with the children. But I make it up at different times then, where I have a whole period of time where I spend a lot of time with the children. And from little onwards, my children knew about this, and I've always been very open, talk to them about it. And it's interesting because I always check in and ask them how they feel, about everything. They admire me for what I've achieved. They don't feel like they've been neglected in any form. But there's been a lot of open communication about it. And they know that they are fundamentally my priority, even if there are a couple nights a week when I have to work late. But then I'll make it up for them and spend the whole weekend with them. So or if I have I've also had times where I've had a couple weeks where I've had to travel or whatever. But then I make it up and take them on a trip somewhere and we just spend our time together. So I think it's a back and forth that happens.
Got it. Yeah. And I think you nailed it it sounds like open communication, expectation management, and they play a key role. And the fascinating thing is, because I don't have kids myself, and I'm like, wow, that's what I am coaching leaders on as well. Like, what a human need for transparency and openness across the board, whether it's in your personal life or your professional life, to let people know also they are fundamentally integral to the scenario and the existence and the unit as a whole. So I appreciate that.
Raabia, can I add something to this? So because I actually teach this also, there's research now that shows that, do you realize that working mothers today in the United States spend as much or more time with their children than stay-at-home mothers did in the 1960s? So we have changed the expectation of the amount of time that we put into parenting, for example. It's called intensive parenting. So, so we also have to negotiate with ourselves what we think is appropriate and right. So
yeah, I love that. And I think you said something earlier that just kind of hits on that note. It's not necessarily helpful or effective to compare your scenarios with others, because each child, each family has different needs, and what is appropriate in one may not be the same for another. So talk about the essence of reconciliation for sure. Yes.
Reconciling with yourself.
Yeah.
I think that's the, I see a lot of women in particular, but I know a couple of men like this too. It's not just women who are stressed, men are stressed as well.
Sure.
I know several women who constantly are feeling guilty. And they're like, oh, I don't spend enough time with my children. I don't spend enough time at my job. Again, I think you have to make peace with yourself. We are, for example, the kind of job I have, we're lucky to have, I have flexibility built into my job. I earn enough money. I have many privileges that come with this job. And that also influences the lifestyle of my children. They're able to live in a nice house. They go to a good school. We get to travel, so they have privileges that come from my working very hard. And that we have to reconcile that piece of things. And people don't always do that.
Yeah.
They only look at one side of the equation instead of looking at the whole.
At the whole, yeah. I think that's a helpful kind of way to bring this full circle, is looking at the whole. It's multifaceted. We're looking at different pieces of the puzzle, and none of us operate really in a vacuum. Whatever we do has an impact personally or professionally. So I think navigating that is part of the journey, not just of leaders with titles really, but just leaders and people in general in the workplace and in their personal lives. So Bahira, here's my last question for you. I would love your take on this. What advice would you give to up and coming, high potential women leaders in particular who are trying to enact positive changes in the workplace, especially as it relates to how women leaders are viewed? Like, what can they do, women, for themselves? And then the other piece is, how can we have allies, or how can allies support this endeavor as well?
Big question. I think it's really important to find a support network. So people you can learn from. It doesn't need to be one person, but several people. I mentioned that, for example, your aunt has given me very good advice. One needs people like this, people whose opinions you can trust. Ideally, somebody who has had a similar journey in whatever way, so that when challenges arise, so that you have someone you can kind of bounce things back and forth on. That's the first. The second is create a team. So, if you're, for example, a big vision person, but don't like details, find somebody to work with who is more detail oriented. Again, sort of be aware of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then build on those. In terms of relationships at work, I think it's extremely important to be consistent so that people can rely on you. One of the problems I have seen is I've seen people who've wanted, I have some colleagues, they're very smart and they would really like to go into administration, but they're not seen as being consistent, and they're seen as being volatile. And so that directly creates a barrier to moving forward. I think you need to be good to yourself. I think you need to be kind to yourself. I think a lot of women, and I know I do this, you have a little voice in the back of your head always saying, "Oh, you do this better. You should have tried harder at this." You know what? Sometimes things are not going to work. Even the best idea sometimes for whatever reason, is going to fall flat. So you have to accept that you're going to have some wins and some losses along the way. Not everything is going to be a win, and it is okay, and you need to stay the course. So, and like I said, you need to be kind to yourself and to others. A couple of years ago, this is my last piece of advice, years ago, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had an essay in the New York Times, and her advice, which I have loved and it has stayed with me, was her parting words were, "In marriage and at work, you have to let some things go." And I really like that, and I try to follow that. So there are going to be a lot of issues that come up in one's workplace. Some are just not worth pursuing. Sometimes you just let the other side have its win and you move on. So.
And you move on. Yeah. I think that's so powerful, this notion of consistency of character, kind of showing up with reliability. And one of the things I know in coaching, I always like to emphasize is, what is the nature of the beast? And then what's in your realm of control? And then how do those two things interact? And that idea of sometimes you have to let some things go. And I will tell you that self-talk, that voice in our heads, I mean, it's 24/7. And I know there's some research that's been done that says that the voice in our head actually can be ours. It could be a distant relatives. It could be whoever, but something is there. And the thoughts, they run 3 times faster than spoken word. So they are always there. It's always happening. So how does one kind of manage that to be more supportive along the way? For sure.
And I would add also, be yourself. I tell my junior colleagues, for example, we get young people, they're coming just straight out of their doctoral programs. They've done a ton of research, and now they also have to teach. And a lot of them are not used to being up in front of a lot of people and trying to make, complicated concepts digestible for 18
Yeah.
years. And I tell them, you're going to learn along the way. You're not going to get it right the first time. Maybe you will, but a lot of times you won't. So be yourself, be authentic. And if something doesn't work out, acknowledge it, but start to piece together what you're good at, what you're not as good at, and it will evolve over time. And you will become better at whatever it is that you're doing. But the important thing is not to give up and just be persistent and to stay the course.
Totally. Stay the course. Well, I love that. I think that's a beautiful note for us to end on. Staying the course, focusing on strengths, such a believer of that in terms of each individual's contributions to themselves, to the world. So Bahira, thank you so much. It's been a delight to chat with you. I feel like we could talk for hours on end. So this is so informative, and thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us. It means so much to me.
Raabia, this was so wonderful. Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you. And thank you for the interesting discussion.
Absolutely. And to all of you who have been tuning in, thank you for being a part of it. Thank you for your lovely comments that have been coming in as well. And I want to say stay tuned for Legit Leadership Live episode 7 next month. So more details coming there. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bahira. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.